And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session this afternoon in the Philippine market. As you can see, this is actually the first time that we are allocating one full session for the Philippines. And for all the good reasons, I should say, the market is heating up, investors are coming in, and startups are sprouting nationwide. My name is Mars Mosqueda. I am the Philippine correspondent of DealStreetAsia. And this panel, we will explore the potential of the market and the top themes investors are betting on and why. And then we will try to answer the big question. Now that investor interest is rising, can the Philippines deliver? I'm so honored right now to be joined in this panel by three distinguished panelists. Our first panelist is Minette Navarrete. Minette is the vice chairman and president of Kickstart Ventures, the largest venture play in the Philippines. Kickstart's active fund closed at 180 million last year. I think that's the biggest so far in the Philippines. And in 2019, Kickstart managed to secure a big exit when Indonesia's Gojek acquired its portfolio company, Coins.ph. Good afternoon, Minette.
Good afternoon, Mars. Good to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. We also have Franco Varona, the managing partner at Foxmont Capital Partners. It's a venture capital firm that invests in early stage Filipino-focused and Filipino-founded startups. Foxmont's portfolio includes Educacion, NextPay, Bookie, Idamama, and a lot more. And prior to Foxmont, Franco was the founding general manager of Grab Philippines. Good afternoon, Franco. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Mars. Thanks for having me.
And of course, our third panelist is Lawrence Chu, the co-founder of Hong Kong-based fintech startup Oriente. Oriente has a deep presence in the Philippines through fintech platform Cashalo. Chu has over 16 years of international investment experience and founded the investment company Black Pine. Thank you, everyone, for joining this panel.
Mars. Hi, everybody.
So let's begin. The startup ecosystem in the Philippines is opening up and increasingly getting interest from, foreign investors lately. If we go by data, last year we saw that 8 of 13 venture capital deals in the country were backed by foreign investors. And this year so far, we also saw 10 of the 19 venture investments that have already seen participation from global investors. So is the sector ecosystem finally coming out of the woods? And what is driving the interest in the local market? I'd like to ask the question first to Minette.
Oh, okay. Well, the Philippines has always been of interest because it's a reasonably sized consumer market. It's got a population in a demographic sweet spot, right? They're young, they're digital, they are keen to consume. For a tech startup ecosystem to flourish, though, you need more than the demographics. You need the confluence of an environment that supports startups, whether it's public policy or internet infrastructure. You need market readiness, you need customer demand, and most importantly, you need startups executing well. So we're seeing, certainly in the last few years, the arrival of Filipino digital consumers and Filipino digital businesses. And these are enabled by, much more pervasive internet connectivity, affordable device plans, well-established use cases. So the consequence of this is that startups are scaling, they're demonstrating the ability to monetize, to go commercial, and investors, local and global, are taking notice.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Minette. What about your thoughts, Franco?
Yeah, I mean, to echo much of what Minette said, I think that actually we're looking at a few factors combining all at the same time, all in 2021, right? So on the international front, Indonesia, it is super hot. It's almost too hot, right? There are already many uber capitalized unicorns, country-focused funds that can already fund the startups internally to growth in Indonesia. So what does that actually mean? It actually leaves many regional venture capital firms looking for other investable locations, right? Two is actually the rapid digitalization of the Philippines. Now, the pandemic has unfortunately affected everybody in the world, but the other thing that we're actually seeing is that Filipinos were actually forced to use the internet in ways that they had never used before. So we went from primarily analog pre-pandemic, and by the way, also almost exclusively using Facebook as our internet in the Philippines, to actually being forced to use digital products during the world's longest lockdown. That's 3.5 months. We were all indoors. I mean, I lost my tan, right?
Okay.
This actually led directly to 112 million people learning how to use the internet, accessing different parts of services, making payments online, buying baby goods online. That's actually a very interesting point to take a look at, right? That drives a lot of interest in the local market. And the third is actually an emergence of local champions, right? So we already know that they're already, we know that there are already existing grassroots, internationally vetted startup champions on the ground here in the Philippines. And these are the first few that have really cast a spotlight in the Philippine market to show that the TAM of the Philippines is enough. So often in the past, investors looked at the Philippines for, let's say, IP, new ideas, and maybe grow that startup abroad. So invest here, but move it abroad. But I think nowadays investors are starting to look at the Philippines as more and more, and I'm sure that Lawrence will speak to this later on, that the Philippines is more and more of a viable consumer market on its own. So I think when you combine those three factors, that really does drive the growth of the ecosystem here in the Philippines.
So based on your observation, Franco,
Yeah.
what are the themes that these investors are betting on right now in the Philippines?
So I think they're betting on the Philippines as a whole, right? I don't think there's specific themes or industries that are emerging more than the other. And actually, one only really needs to look at the news that comes out of, well, DealStreetAsia, right? So I mean, look at the kind of investments that you're announcing from the Philippines: vertical commerce, cloud kitchens, media and live streaming, e-commerce enablement, and even NFTs, right? I mean, these are the types. Investors are looking for the right opportunity in the Philippines, but the thing is, the Philippines itself, in and of itself, is the right opportunity. It's an investment in the digitalization of the Philippines.
True. Thank you, Franco. For Lawrence, Oriente, your fintech company, secured 20 million to bolster its services in the Philippines, and I think this can go up to 50 million. And your Kashalo app has grown its user base to a couple of million customers in the Philippines. Your thoughts on how the country's fintech space in particular has evolved? Is there still room for growth? Is there still room for new players, Lawrence?
Absolutely. I mirror what Franco and Minette was saying. I mean, when we chose the three main markets to enter into Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Philippines by far is our most important market. Evidently, it is because of demographics, but more so now it is that opportunity and change. And for us in the Philippines, the most important thing I respect is the Filipinos, of course. It's the people and the opportunity. It's an opportunity where there is a need, a demand, and there's an opportunity because people want it. So I think in terms of fintech, we see that as a slightly different approach, but slightly maybe even higher value, a marketplace to enter. And quite frankly, Philippines, it has been really the bright spark, I think, in terms of fintech development and evolution. And from a variety of different points of view. Obviously, we're active in the buy now, pay later space and kind of facilitation of payments, and hopefully that can enable more financial inclusion in terms of finance, banking, insurance, wealth management, so on and so forth. But I think Philippines has been a testing ground for one of the very most interesting developments, I think, in sort of the next generation of finance, so the decentralized finance space in terms of play to earn models and other aspects. And we're rapidly encompassing that into what we're doing and building that out over the next 12 months as well. So I think in terms of numbers, what we've seen also through 19 to 2020, probably going from 100 to over 200 fintech companies just in the Philippines. But I think in the last year, given what's happened during lockdown and COVID, increasingly more startups are happening. And we see that as other ecosystem plays mature. So the Gojek, Grab, Toko type of maturity, we see a lot of talent moving out of some of these bigger companies and into sort of the next generation of startups and growth players, including ourselves, but also really startups. Like I think where, Franco and Minette will see a lot of interesting talent coming out to start new businesses and companies that will address some of these problems and wishes of even the government. So, the BSP governor has said before, he wants over 70% of Filipino adults to be transacting online digital format, right, by 2023, which is just around the corner. So, there's a lot of catalysts, including the pandemic, that is allowing for this opportunity to happen. And we see, like in the Philippines, that's a very big opportunity for fintech investors and fintech startups.
Lawrence makes a
Yes.
really good point, because years ago, I think 10 years ago, maybe the bigger startups were the enterprise solutions. And that's not surprising, because when you think of our history and the rise of BPOs, then a lot of times it was a bet on the skill, but it was a service that was offered to other companies. I think what has happened in the past few years is really that we are now betting on the Filipino consumer.
Correct.
And therefore, the B2C startups have started to emerge. And I think both Franco and Lawrence will say that quite a lot of what we're seeing is the adoption of both corporates as partners, but rather more importantly, of a broader consumer base. And that's exciting.
It's 112 million Filipinos going online all at the same time.
I mean, that throws up a huge opportunity for fintech, e-commerce, and tech related startups. But what do you think are the challenges, Lawrence?
Well, I mean, for us, in terms of challenges, in most of the countries we work with, it's always a couple of factors. It's always talent. So making sure that we have the talent to grow ourselves, but also grow the ecosystem. And then, of course, on the flip side, it's always government and regulators alike. So, we work very closely with regulators, but at the same time, we need to understand where they come from. So that's always been a challenge. So for us, in terms of fintech, the opportunity is that there is a very large number of unbanked population out of that 112 million, right? And that for us is a massive opportunity. Yet, we look at incumbents and where they come from and how they will evolve, and they see, potentially see us and other startups as a threat, right? So how do we encourage competition, and how do we bring some of these incumbents in line so that at the end of the day, it is really to serve the people, right? I mean, we're really doing this to better people's lives and to be able to give them what they fully deserve. So for us, that's always going to be the number one goal.
Yeah, that's to address the needs of the people. I'd like to go to Franco for this question. Now that the Philippine startups are starting to get noticed by global VCs, Franco, what are your projections for the market? If you can share with us, what are your investor friends are sharing during your online chats right now?
Yeah, I mean, my projections are growth, right? I mean, there's just no doubt about it, right? So let's start with a few really interesting numbers over the years that we've been tracking, right? So as you know, Foxmont itself comes out with a Philippine venture capital report at the end of every year. We started last year. We're going to publish another one soon. One of the numbers that we track is actually investments into the startup ecosystem. In 2017, we saw $18 million go into the ecosystem as investments, okay? In 2020, sorry, most of that was probably from Kickstart, by the way. In 2020, with the lockdowns, with the pandemic, that actually tracked to $183.8 million. That was a 10x from 3 years prior. You know what the number is this year? To date, this is September 22, so nine and a half months in, $437.5 million. just in the first half of this year. That's how much money is now coming into this ecosystem. So it's going to be a lot of growth. And you know what? This is not like unheard of. It's not unprecedented. Like this happened in Indonesia 10 years ago, right? And this is in the early 2010s. So if you actually look at it, in Indonesia in 2012, let's say, the investments were 44 million, right? In 2012. And then in 2016, there was a 31x growth, $1.4 billion. And then in 2017, it was $2 billion, right? Into the startup ecosystem. And if you actually track the emergence of unicorns, which we'll speak about later on, you can actually see it lines up perfectly with the foreign investments that go into the country. Sorry, I shouldn't say foreign, but foreign and domestic investments that go into the ecosystem. In other words, if you think about it, we are in the extremely early days of the same type of cycle beginning in the Philippines, right? So one is increasing investor attention, right? And then two is really the emergence of champions and unicorns. That's where we're about to get there soon for the Philippines. And then the third is actually the creation of more unicorns and the subsequent former employees of these unicorns becoming ESOP millionaires, emerging to create their own startups and their own mafias, right? And then step four is actually just go all the way back to step one. It's a cycle. And we're just in the very, very early stages of our first cycle. So it's going to be a lot of growth really soon.
All right. Thank you, Franco. But as they say in business, when demand rises, the price also increases. Minette, your thoughts on valuations. What do you expect now that the market is starting to heat up?
Well, I mean, certainly for ourselves, right? We've been in the market for quite a while. So we feel quite positively about the valuations of high-performing local startups breaking $100 million to start. I mean, that's what we want. Just get them to $100 million, validate that. And this is particularly good news against the backdrop of something people whisper about, the Philippine discount. When we begin to demonstrate that we are able to start, to scale, to become profitable, then that Philippine discount ought to go away. And then we are optimistic that that will happen. At the same time, you know, there's quite a lot of dry powder from funds that had set up maybe 5 years ago. And so while maybe a corporate or a strategic VC might be more patient, pure financial players are going to look to deploy more capital more rapidly. And that means good choices for good startups, right? The option to pick the appropriate investor for themselves and to get a good value. So a little tension is always good, I find. I think when you look at it, you know, kind of not so much a prediction as it is an observation. You can see that there are many more angel investor networks who are taking a closer look, investing more. You see more venture capital funds start to invest and at earlier stages. And then rather interestingly, you see PE firms coming in and investing earlier too in typical venture capital rounds. And I think that's going to be good for the ecosystem as a whole.
But how do you view the inflow of foreign capital? Will it prompt you to gear up and launch new funds in the next few months or few years?
For Kickstart,
Yes.
you know, let me maybe parse that into two parts. We expect we will be raising and launching new funds, but that's not going to be anytime soon. We just announced the active fund, our third fund, last year. So we still have quite a lot of dry powder from that. But the other thing is, I think when you think of us, certainly for ourselves historically, when we launched our first fund in 2012, there wasn't a big startup scene in the Philippines. There weren't, you know, dedicated, sizable tech investors. There wasn't a lot of overseas capital coming in. The ecosystem needed to be stimulated. When we launched our second fund in 2015, you could already see that foreign investors were coming in, but you know, they'd come in and then they would decide not as much deal flow to set up a dedicated office in the Philippines and have boots on the ground. That's changed in the last few years. You see that they will have dedicated people, not a full office, but they will have scouts on the ground. And I think that matters. I think you can see that over time, there is much more interest. Did we need it? Did Kickstart need it to launch funds? We didn't. We are from here. We are rooted in the Philippines. We believe in the ecosystem, and we have a commitment to national development. So we don't need that validation from overseas, but it's nice to see.
Thank you, Minette. Franco, you are raising 20 million for your second fund, and as far as I know, you're targeting to close this within the year. Where are we at right now?
Oh, we're in a good place, Mars.
Okay, good to know. So
We're ready. We're ready.
all right, so you're gonna be closing that before the year ends.
I'm sure we will.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Franco. And to
Thanks,
Lawrence, back to Lawrence, we are expecting a rush of capital in the Philippines. And one of the key concerns for any ecosystem that receives a sudden rush of capital is, how founders are able to cope with it. So a number of local startups could be, getting interest of venture investors in the coming days or months. Is there such a thing as too much money for founders, Lawrence?
I mean, I think we've seen some of this in Singapore and Hong Kong, and to a certain extent where they're more targeted towards local population, it can be a problem, and you see startups that gain some seed capital and peter out for a variety of different reasons. In Indonesia, I think it's a slightly different problem. For example, there's a lot of money in, yet it's maybe just a lack of good startups, and it's not a market issue. So I think in Philippines, it will be kind of the same sort of environment. I mean, there's no such thing as too much money. the more going in, the better. Because I think the key thing that Franco and Minette both mentioned is that we're moving towards a kind of a consumer-driven demand cycle, right? So if the current startups and the scene is serving such a small number of people in a very impactful way, if we can start to increase those numbers and reach really that 112 million Filipinos in a also much more deeper way, then I don't think there's enough money to go around, right? So, and then money has to work hand in hand with good founders. Even within our group at Oriente, we've had a number of our senior and not so senior, but just early folks who've gone on to start up a insurance startup in Philippines, a wealth management startup based in Singapore to serve the region. So we're super happy about that. I mean, that's sort of a sign that something is going right, I think, for us and also for the ecosystem. So I think it's a positive thing.
So no such thing as too much money, Lawrence.
No such thing as too much money. I mean, Minette says it right. The challenge will be valuation, right? This kind of goes back to VCs and smart VCs, is balancing between valuation and also who they want to support and back, right? Because ultimately it's the people who drive this.
Yeah. Thank you, Lawrence. For Minette and Franco, how do investors mentor startup founders in scenarios like this? Like, when is it okay to say no to VC money when there's too much money getting in, and what are safeguards? What safeguards you think are needed? I'd like to ask Minette first.
So I want to answer your first question. I like is there such a thing as too much money?
Yeah.
It's a great question. You know what I was going to say? I don't think there is such a thing as too much money. I think there is money that comes in too early and money that comes in too late. Timing is everything. And some of you would have heard me say this before. The best type of funding comes from happy, loyal consumers who are happy to pay you again and again at a price point that makes a decent profit. So there is, that's a great funding model, right? Not every startup needs VC investment. But for the startups that do need VC investment, be great if it was in such high demand, and if they have the clarity of how much they need at a particular stage so that they time it right and they cap it to what they need, then it works really well. Can they say no? Of course they can say no. They can say no for any variety of reasons. It's their company. Whether a round is oversubscribed, or when the term sheet feels wrong, or when they've just raised, for lots of reasons, I think. Founders need to believe that it is their decision. It's not the investor's decision, at least from that perspective. I think it makes sense for founders to understand how they can manage their cap table, because I think it's not just the capital, it is also the cap table and what names are on that cap table that are an asset for the founders.
Yeah, great points, Minette. What about your thoughts, Franco?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo both Lawrence and Minette, I think that, money is like, it will always find its way to the right people at the right time. That's what I think, right? And in that way, then there's different ways that it arrives, in somebody's, operational expenses and operational budget. So I think that there's never a situation where there's too much money, right? I think, smart people will make the right moves around with money. To answer your second question, when is it okay to say no to VC money? Just like Minette, I think it's always okay to say no to VC money. Minette's not here to steal ideas. I'm not here to steal ideas. We're here to support, right? There's something to be said about seed stage investors, early stage investors that are here to mentor and support and guide and educate towards the later rounds of growth. And that's what we are here for, right? This is what Minette's here for. This is what Foxmont is here for. We're here to support, founders that are looking for, let's say, extreme growth without the hindrance of a limited budget. But the other side of that, of course, is we want to mentor. We want to teach them, what are the right ways? Where do we, how do you value your company? Where do you put that money? What sort of investors do you speak to? Who's on your cap table? Who do you think should be on your cap table? That's the sort of network and mentorship that we want to offer as early stage investors. And I think, to answer your next question about, what sort of safeguards are needed, I think just in general, increased education, right? Increased education to founders and startups as to appropriate valuation methods, investor expectations. I think that's enough. These founders are smart. They're smart people. That's why they're growing great businesses. And we want to guide them to be even more successful and investable so that they can go on their own path towards, market dominance and success actually is really what we're looking for. So.
But I think the other safeguard is information, right? The fact that when a lot of power comes from the asymmetry of access to information. But when information is made available, whether it's the regular reports that DealStreetAsia publishes, or the annual report from Foxmont, or just the ability to share information, to create pathways between founders and investors, I think all that safeguards both the founders as well as the investors.
Great. Thank you, Minette and Franco. What about the exits horizon in the Philippines right now? How do you find the exit market in the country? Timeline are you keeping as investor? Minette and Franco. I'll start with Minette.
Oh, in the beginning, I remember I've said for the Philippines about 15 years ago, the average gestation period was about 10 years, right? When you think about Entertainment Gateway Group, they were 7 years old when we acquired them for Globe in 2008. When Chica was acquired by EPLDT in 2009, they were 9 years old. Surpass was 13 years old when they IPO'd in 2014. So in our view, kind of in the decade, say from 2012 to 2022, a sub 10-year exit is an improvement. I think moving forward, we'd like to see the average gestation period shrink, but that's going to have to depend on both the presence of a lot of capital and great companies and use cases that are clear. So from our perspective, I guess we held coins for just about 3 years before Gojek acquired them. We held Wattpad for about 5 years before Naver acquired them this year. So our exit experience is kind of in the 3 to 5 year holding period. But we hope that kind of with a bigger portfolio and a wider multi-stage reach, it'll be very varied, I think.
Yeah, I mean, for us at Foxmont, perhaps contrary to popular opinion, we are very patient people. And we understand that we're in the early stages of the creation of an entire cycle, right? And that cycle that I spoke about earlier, that doesn't start overnight. It's not created overnight. But I do want to say, we do note that it only took a short 5 to 6 years for Indonesia to have its own robust ecosystem, right? And by the way, only 10 years for Indonesia to see a local exit by way of their IDX, right? That's Bukalapak. So we actually believe that the Philippines itself, in and of itself, and finding exits too, by the way, is on an accelerated timeline as well, right? Given the level of digitalization that's coming to the Philippines, given some government initiatives that look like they are very supportive to the startup ecosystem, and given kind of the increased amount of attention that's coming to this country, we really do believe that, timelines will be faster than what we even saw in Indonesia, honestly.
And Mars, can I just add a comment here as well?
Thank you, Franco. Yes, sure, Lawrence.
So this is more from kind of our inbound requests more in the last 6 months. So we do see an increased solicitation by companies in particularly the US, right, looking for targets for US listing opportunities. And probably caused by two things. One, I feel, is the imminent grab listing in the US, and also the geopolitical tensions between the US and China. So, developed markets need growth, and there aren't that many areas in the world that can develop growth at a sizable amount with a kind of consumer-centric target that's also mature enough to take this growth for another 5-10 years at the very minimum. So we see that as a very positive sign. And obviously we've been approached, and we're looking and obviously being very cautious about it as well. As internally, our goal has always been, the next milestone for us is to achieve 100 million US in revenues, which hopefully will be soon. So that's kind of our target and goal. And then, anything about exits and other corporate activities, we can talk about it then. But, obviously as a founder and operator, that's always my goal first, is to make sure that I can get my business to a level of maturity. But I agree with Franco and Minette, it's coming. Everything's shortened due to various external factors. And that's good. I think if you are mature enough and you can sustain and give your investors such exits or distributions, it's good for the ecosystem. And then it also helps, grow and develop the next generation of entrepreneurs and opportunities.
Thanks. That's great points, Lawrence. Now, let's try to move our discussion to the topic of unicorn. I believe that one of the barometers of a super heating up ecosystem is when it starts to mint unicorn. But in the Philippines, there is hardly any noise about us producing unicorn. What are your views on that, Franco?
I like it. I like it because I think it's going to be a welcome surprise when it comes, and it's going to come much sooner than I think people realize and recognize. That's my view on that. I think that the grassroots champions, and this is really what we're talking about, by the way, we're talking about grassroots startups, companies that have been built beyond, let's say, corporate support in the early days. I think that those grassroots startups are rapidly coming. I'm saying like within 18 months of this very day, I will say we will get some great news. So, you mark my words, that I think that we're going to start seeing some amazing things coming from kind of the grassroots community of startups here. Just remember this, right? And again, I mentioned this earlier, just funding wise. Funding from 2017 to the first half of 2021, that's a 25x increase in funding in 4 years. And given the large volume of Zoom calls that I get from foreign funds out of Singapore, China, wherever, US, I fully expect that type of funding will increase more so in an extremely short period of time. So what we're seeing is actually, again, lots more international investors willing to cut larger tickets to dominate a Philippine market. That's one. And two, in the background, the silent yet rapid emergence of what I will call a national startup champion that will come very, very soon.
Yes, Minette.
Gosh, I love the enthusiasm, Franco. But Mars, I think about your question and I think, sometimes breeding a unicorn is exactly as you describe it. It's noise, not signal. And for Kickstart, certainly for the Ayala Group, it matters to solve real problems and to build robust businesses. We're a 187-year-old business house. So our metrics will be more than just kind of the speed and the value. We've seen industries and companies skyrocket and then drop. So for us, breeding a unicorn is not an objective. It is a happy side label. And at the end of the day, high market value is a result of a good company delivering good products and services that are sustainable, keeping its customers happy. I think that's kind of the objective. And if the consequence of that is we get to $1 billion and above in terms of valuation, it's great. But, unicorns, it's a label. That's all it is.
Okay. Thank you, Minette. Last year, DealStreetAsia, wrote something about Revolution Pre-Crafted, the startup that claims to be the Philippines' first unicorn. We've written about the issues it faced. What are your thoughts on, how much the case of Revolution has impacted the startup and VC ecosystem in the Philippines, Minette?
Kickstart didn't actually consider them a unicorn. Franco was making an allusion earlier to non-grassroots. And Revolution Pre-Crafted started within the context of a very large, very established property company. But the Philippines is quite a young ecosystem. Understandably, people want excitement, people want evidence. And the founder and the company that actually owned Revolution Pre-Crafted and the investors tried to stimulate the market. They wanted to create some excitement. So I understand why that happened. It ultimately failed. And, people now have a story of a Philippine startup that didn't deliver. But let's not forget that most startups fail. This one happened to have failed loudly. It's unique in that respect, perhaps, because many startups will start and fail rather quietly. But in many other respects, it's just another company that tried and didn't make it. Um, and that a startup failed would not have been big news if not for the kind of the fanfare that accompanied its debut. So I think as more news comes out of companies that are doing well, that are growing, that are delivering, that are um, attracting both audiences, customers, and investors, over time, that piece of bad news is going to be one story amongst many, and there will be many other stories, good and bad, that the ecosystem will have. So I don't think
Yeah.
it's I don't think it's a catastrophic blow, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't know if if Franco and Lawrence have a different perspective. I'm curious.
Yes, Franco.
Uh, hmm. I think a lot of very positive things came from you know, let's say from that news. So let's start with that, right? Let's start from the news breaking at that point onwards. And what I saw was actually the emergence of extremely sound startups that had a lot of, well, meat and potatoes behind it, that had great founders with great visions and were executing amazing services and products, during the pandemic. So let's start with that, right? I think that there were lessons to be learned from previous startups, right? And I think that those lessons were taken to heart by who were already existing in the startup ecosystem and had seen, let's say, learning from past mistakes, let's put it that way. And I think that what really that has done has galvanized and strengthened the types of founders and operators that we have operating in our ecosystem today.
Great, great. For Lawrence, I can see that fintech has a lot of promise, and I think it's gonna be probably the first store to produce the country's unicorn. Lawrence, what do you think is the regulatory environment in the Philippines supportive right now for fintech to grow and produce the country's billion-dollar company?
Well, I think obviously fintech is a sector that has deep impact into and touch points into a lot of consumers. And the fact is that it is one segment that can take in quite a bit of investment. And you can see by the number of digital banking license that's been issued recently, but also stopped a new issuance recently as well. So I think the regulatory environment, we work quite closely with various regulators around the region, and the BSP is quite progressive when it comes to fintech and technology. The late Governor Espanilla was a very strong advocate, and tying kind of results with social economic impact, and his successor, similarly, Governor Dioscono, also the same thing, very supportive of fintech. The key with all regulators, I think, not just in Philippines, is regulation usually comes behind, right? I mean, that's how regulation usually happens, and that's always the challenge, right? Because and I'm sitting in Hong Kong, and actually, over the last couple of days, I've spent a lot of time with a few regulators here, ex-regulators here, talking about the same situation. I mean, not necessarily the exact same situation in terms of fintech, but there's been a lot of rules and new regulation and discussion about how to regulate crypto. And and to me, crypto and fintech, finance kind of go hand in hand. And the regulators take a view which I respect, but at the same time, I urge them to understand really what some of these startups and entrepreneurs, innovators are trying to do.
Okay.
Yes, we'll always have the challenge of bad actors and startups that fail for a variety of different reasons. Some of them is market reasons, some of them are team-based issues. But it's very important to learn from them and also make sure that the regulators put a framework around what is really designed to weed out bad actors, but not designed to set up failure and designed to create barriers to growth, right?
All right.
So I think that's very important. If you want to succeed in certain areas, particularly in fintech and DeFi and crypto to a certain extent, you have to be quite progressive, I feel.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lawrence. We are actually running out of time right now, but before we go, I would like to ask this final question to everyone. It's just a quick question. Does the country have all that it takes to create a potentially successful startup? I'd like to ask Lawrence first.
Absolutely.
Question.
I mean, we are 100% committed to Philippines ourselves. We are growing, as I said, some of our Oriente team members have developed their own startups, so we're proud of them. We're about to launch new product categories in Philippines with new kind of brand because of the growing maturity and opportunity we see in the Philippines. So absolutely, we are going more than doubling down on the Philippines, I would say. Okay. So I'm gonna really step on the gas and hopefully help hit our goals and mission, right? Really is to serve the Filipinos in and out of the country and to help them achieve financial inclusion and success.
All right, thank you. Just quick one, Franco.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and it already has, right? To me, a robust ecosystem has several elements, 3 key elements actually. One is actually independent country-focused venture capital. That's Foxmont, right? There's corporate venture capital, right? That's Kickstart, right? And of course, the last is interested foreign investors and operators. That's Oriente. So actually, you were able to get all 3 in this panel today, right?
Great. Thank you. Thanks. Minette.
Absolutely, yes. I think there are many things that you need aside from the investors. I think the other thing that we are seeing is a lot of angel investor activity. So in addition to what Franco says, to have the angels means that we can do a relay across and make sure that startups are supported at every stage of their development and that they will be able to grow throughout all the stages. And that matters because the experience at every stage can make or break the startups. And fundamentally, that is what builds a successful startup ecosystem.
All right. Thank you, Minette. Thank you, Franco and Lawrence. Thank you for your time to speak to us today about the potential of the Philippine market. And that's all the time that we have. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.